December 7, 1941. A quiet morning in Hawaii turns into a nightmare. Japanese planes scream across the sky, bombs fall, and ships burn. Pearl Harbor is under attack. For many, this was the beginning. But for millions in Asia, the war had already begun years earlier. In China, cities were already in ruins. In Manchuria, people lived under occupation. And across the Pacific, Japan had been preparing, expanding, invading, and dreaming of an empire that could rival the West. What made Imperial Japan risk everything? What drove a small island nation to challenge giants like the United States and Britain? Was it survival, pride, or something more dangerous? This is the story of Imperial Japan and the Asia-Pacific War, a story of power, brutality, ambition, and collapse, a war that reshaped Asia and changed the world forever. For over 2 centuries, Japan shut itself off from the outside world. No foreign ships, no outside influence. It was a nation in isolation, peaceful, rigid, and deeply rooted in tradition. But in 1853, that silence shattered. American warships, led by Commodore Matthew Perry, arrived with an ultimatum: open your ports or face the consequences. Japan chose to open, and in doing so it chose transformation. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. The emperor was restored to power, and the country launched into a breakneck race toward modernization: railroads, factories, a national army, a navy modeled after Britain. In just a few decades, Japan went from samurai swords to steel battleships. And soon, it wanted more. In 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, seizing Taiwan. In 1905, it shocked the world again, defeating the mighty Russian Empire in battle. For the first time, an Asian power had bested a major Western empire. The message was clear: Japan was no longer a pupil. It was a rival. By the early 20th century, Japan was no longer content with being just a nation. It wanted to be an empire. Korea was annexed, Taiwan was absorbed, and the idea of dominating East Asia began to take shape. Beneath the surface, new ideology was rising: a belief in Japanese racial superiority, a destiny to lead Asia, and a growing resentment of the Western powers that once humiliated them. Imperial Japan had modernized its weapons, its economy, and its image. But its ambitions were rooted in an ancient hunger, power, pride, and place in the world, and it was only just beginning. By the 1930s, Japan had transformed itself into a modern empire. But it was an empire with a problem. It had the factories, the ships, the guns, but not the fuel, not the steel, not the raw materials. Japan was rich in ambition, but poor in resources, and that imbalance would soon drive it to war. In 1931, without approval from its own government, the Japanese army staged a false attack on a railway in Manchuria, China. They blamed Chinese saboteurs, then used it as an excuse to invade it. It wasn't just a border skirmish. Japan took all of Manchuria in months and turned it into a puppet state. Manchukuo, the League of Nations, condemned the aggression. Japan responded by leaving the League. The message was clear: Japan would no longer follow Western rules. It would make its own. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, city after city fell, and with them came horror. The rape of Nanjing, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands slaughtered, civilians raped, bodies dumped in rivers. The brutality was staggering. But for Japan's military leaders, it was justified. They believed China would fall quickly. They were wrong. The war in China dragged on. Japanese forces were stretched thin, and the world began to take notice. The United States, Britain, and the Dutch cut off exports of vital materials, especially oil, for Japan. That was a death sentence. Without oil, its navy would stop, its planes would sit idle, its empire would grind to a halt. The Japanese leadership now faced a terrible choice: back down or break through. And so, in back rooms and war councils, a decision was made. Japan would strike fast, strike hard, and take what it needed by force. It would seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia. It would knock the United States out of the Pacific. It would fight the West before the West could stop it. It was a gamble, a massive, reckless gamble, and it would change the course of history. When Japan went to war, it didn't say it was building an empire. It said it was building unity. The name was long and ambitious: the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a grand vision of Asia free from Western colonialism, united under Japanese leadership. No more British in India, no more French in Indochina, no more Americans in the Philippines, Asia for Asians. It sounded like liberation. It looked like revolution, but it felt on the ground a lot like empire. In truth, the co-prosperity sphere was less about prosperity, more about control. In every country Japan conquered, it replaced one master with another. It set up puppet governance, stripped economies for Japan's war machine, forced labor from civilians, looted food, metal and oil. In Indonesia, rice was taken from the poor to feed Japanese troops. In Korea, children were taught to speak Japanese and worship the emperor. In Burma, soldiers ruled with brutality. And across Southeast Asia, local hopes of independence were crushed under the weight of occupation. To Japan, this was necessary sacrifice. To its neighbors, it was hypocrisy dressed as freedom. Japanese propaganda spoke of harmony, unity, and shared destiny. But its policies told another story, a story of extraction, repression, and cultural erasure. Even those who welcomed the Japanese at first grew disillusioned, angry, and desperate to resist. The co-prosperity sphere was meant to inspire. Instead, it exposed the brutal truth. Japan hadn't come to free Asia, it had come to rule it. It was early morning in Hawaii. December 7, 1941. The sky was calm, the ships were still, and then chaos. Japanese bombers roared over Pearl Harbor, dropping torpedoes and bombs with deadly precision. Battleships exploded, planes burned on the tarmac. In just 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were dead. The United States had been dragged into the war, but Pearl Harbor was just one piece of a much larger plan. On that very same day, across thousands of miles, Japanese forces struck everywhere. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island. It was a coordinated assault the world had never seen before, and it worked. Japan advanced like a tidal wave. In just months, it seized vast territories. Singapore, once thought invincible, fell in days. Burma crumbled. Indonesia, rich in oil, was captured. The Philippines, defended by US and Filipino troops, was slowly overrun. The Japanese war machine moved with terrifying speed, well-trained, highly disciplined, fueled by purpose and propaganda. To its own people, Japan was winning a righteous war, a war to free Asia and secure the nation's destiny. But to those in its path, it felt like something else: occupation, destruction, fear. Cities were bombed. Resistance was crushed. Entire populations were forced into obedience. Japanese troops saw surrender as dishonor, and so mercy was rare. Posts were beaten, starved, executed. Civilians often fared worse. The early phase of the war was a storm, and in that storm it looked for a moment like Japan might actually succeed. Its empire now stretched from the frozen forests of Manchuria to the jungles of New Guinea. The rising sun flew over millions, but behind the victories, cracks were forming. The Japanese military was overextended, supplies were thin, and the United States, wounded but enraged, was preparing for a long, brutal fight. The tide had not yet turned, but it soon would. In the beginning, Japan's victories seemed unstoppable, but every empire that rises eventually meets resistance. And in 1942, that resistance began to roar. The first turning point came at Midway. In June 1942, Japan launched a bold plan to lure the US Navy into a trap. But American codebreakers had already cracked Japan's communications. The trap flipped. In just one day, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, the heart of its naval power. It was a blow from which the Imperial Navy would never fully recover. From that moment on, the momentum shifted, slowly, painfully, island by island. The US adopted a new strategy: island hopping, not conquering every Japanese-held island, just the key ones. Airfields, naval bases, supply routes. Each step brought them closer to Japan itself. In places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, fighting was brutal. Tropical heat, disease, hand-to-hand combat in the mud and jungle. Japanese soldiers often chose death over surrender. Many civilians, fearing dishonor or punishment, followed them. The Allies advanced, but the cost was staggering. In 1944, at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history unfolded. The Japanese Navy threw everything it had to stop the Americans. It failed. And for the first time, Japan unleashed a new weapon: kamikaze pilotsmen who volunteered to crash their planes into enemy ships, suicide as strategy. Desperation turned into doctrine. As the Allies closed in, Japan's leaders clung to one hope: that massive casualties would force the West to negotiate peace on favorable terms. But the Allies weren't planning to negotiate. They were planning to invade, and Japan was preparing for one final apocalyptic stand. The tide had turned, and now the empire stood on the edge of its own destruction. Behind the headlines, beyond the battleships and battle plans, was the brutal truth of war. For civilians across Asia, the Japanese occupation was not strategy, it was survival. In China, the nightmare had started early. The rape of Nanjing in 1937 was just the beginning. Mass executions, rape, looting, bodies piled in rivers, entire cities emptied of life. Elsewhere, the cruelty continued. In Korea, thousands of young women were forced into sexual slavery, euphemistically called comfort women. They were taken from their homes, beaten, and used by soldiers day after day. Many never returned. In the Philippines, civilians were massacred during the Manila Campaign. Indonesia, forced laborers Remusho were worked to death building roads, railways, and fortifications. Tens of thousands died from disease, starvation, or punishment. Perhaps most horrifying was Unit 731 in Manchuria, a secret facility where Japanese scientists conducted human experiments, vivisections without anesthesia, biological weapons tests on live prisoners. It wasn't just soldiers who suffered, it was children, women, the elderly. But the empire faced resistance in the jungles of Burma. Freedom fighters sabotaged railways and supply lines. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters refused to surrender, even when their cities fell. In China, a divided nation still fought tooth and nail against occupation. Every advance Japan made was shadowed by defiance, not just from foreign armies but from ordinary people fighting, hiding, surviving, trying to hold on to dignity. In a world that had lost its humanity. By 1945, the weight of resistance and retribution was closing in. The empire was crumbling, but the worst was yet to come. By 1945, Japan was losing badly. Its navy was shattered, its cities were isolated, its people were starving, but it would not surrender. In the skies above Japan, a new kind of warfare was taking shape: strategic bombing on a scale the world had never seen. The most devastating came on the night of March 9, 1945. Over Tokyo, American B-29 bombers dropped thousands of incendiary bombs. The wooden city burned. Just one night, over 100,000 civilians were killed, more than in either atomic bombing that would follow. And yet, Japan fought on. Leaders prepared civilians to resist with bamboo spears. Children were trained to die for the emperor. An invasion of the home islands called Operation Downfall was expected to kill millions. Then came the moment that changed history. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, a single bomb, a blinding flash. Within seconds, an entire city reduced to ash. Tens of thousands died instantly, or followed in agony. 3 days later, August 9, Nagasaki, the second atomic bomb fell. Another city erased, for the first time in human history. One weapon had ended a war by threatening the end of the world, but even then, Japan hesitated. It wasn't until the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria that the decision was made. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation, his voice heard for the first time by the Japanese people. He called for peace. The war was over. The empire that had once stretched across Asia was gone. Its cities burned, its army broken, its people devastated. But even in defeat, a question lingered. Was this the price of ambition, or the cost of forgetting our shared humanity? The war ended, but its shadow never left. Across Asia, scars remained on cities, on families, in memory, and the legacy of Imperial Japan became a mirror, reflecting pride, pain, denial, and deep division. In China, the war is remembered as a national trauma, a time of heroic resistance and horrific suffering. In Korea, wounds from occupation still shape politics and identity. The memory of forced labor, comfort women, and cultural erasure continues to fuel anger generations later. In Southeast Asia, Japan's brief liberation from Western powers is seen as another kind of colonization, one that promised freedom but brought repression. And in Japan itself, the legacy is complicated. After the war, the US helped rebuild the nation into an economic powerhouse, but also shielded many wartime leaders from justice. Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne. Many in Japan saw themselves as victims of the war, especially after the atomic bombings. Others struggled with guilt and silence. For decades, Japanese textbooks softened the brutality. War crimes were omitted, the Nanjing massacre debated, but not forgotten, especially outside Japan. To this day, visits by Japanese officials to war shrines spark outrage in China and Korea. Old wounds reopen, old questions return. How does a nation remember when memory itself is a battlefield? Some Japanese citizens push for truth and accountability. Others ask, why must we apologize for the past forever? The Asia-Pacific War didn't just shape borders, it shaped identity. It shaped how nations see each other, and how they see themselves. And perhaps that's the final legacy of Imperial Japan, that the war didn't truly end. In 1945, its consequences lie in politics, in memory, in the silence between nations. The story of Imperial Japan and the Asia-Pacific War is not just about nations and battles. It's about choices. A nation that transformed itself from isolation to empire, that rose through industry, ambition, and military might, then fell through pride, brutality, and overreach. It's a warning how quickly modernity can be mistaken for morality, how dreams of unity can mask domination, how propaganda, nationalism, and fear can drive people to unthinkable acts. But it's also a reminder that history is not distant. Its echoes are alive in every unresolved memory, every disputed monument, every uneasy alliance. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons are eternal. That unchecked power breeds disaster, that empires built on suffering do not last, and that humanity, it forgets, repeats. Today, Japan stands as a peaceful, democratic nation, its cities rebuilt, its people respected, but the past remains, not to condemn, but to understand, because in that understanding, there's hope. Hope that the next time a nation stands at a crossroads, it chooses peace over conquest, truth over denial, memory over silence. The rising sun once lit the path to war, may it now light the way to wisdom.